Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure and honor to be here, and thanks again to Professor Manalo for inviting me to Kyoto University. As you said, I'm a researcher at the German Institute for International Educational Research located in Berlin, and I'm going to be talking about parental homework involvement, and I will be try to get the, let's say, German and Swiss perspective brought, because I could imagine that the perspective here in Japan on homework and how parents are involved in children's learning is quite different from our perspective. And please, if you have any questions in between, clarifying questions, or if about the broader German system, or maybe specifically to my research, please just let me know, and then maybe later on we can go more into the substantive discussion. I thought to give you some idea of what I do besides homework and what I've done in the past, and maybe for those of you who will join us for dinner later, you know what to talk to me about besides, I mean, in terms of work. So again, I'm in Berlin located. I have a PhD in educational psychology, so that's kind of where my heart is. At the same time, I have been trying to broaden my horizon by visiting other countries, mostly the United States. I did a research visit at the School of Education at Stanford University, and I was recently visiting Teachers College at Columbia University in New York City. And actually both of those research visits were with professors for sociology, because I'm also very interested in educational inequalities. And so I wanted to broaden my psychological perspective by engaging with sociological research. What might also be interesting, as in sort of the background where I'm coming from, I have not only spent time in academia, I've also engaged with the OECD, more specifically the Center for Educational Research and Innovation, and there I was involved in two projects on innovative learning environments and innovative pedagogies. So also trying to understand how can schools be transformed, how can schools change their practices to reflect more the kind of skills needed in our current societies. And it's very great to be in Japan and to broaden my horizon to the Japanese academic world, is in particular educational psychology. And the reason I had the opportunity to come to Japan because I will be inviting the Science and Technology in Society Forum, which will actually take place in Kyoto starting tomorrow until Tuesday, where lots of different disciplines, and actually I might be the only psychologist there, will meet to discuss global problems of the world, and to exchange with policymakers to things like climate change and several big kind of issues. Yes, and so my research interests are parental homework involvement, what I'm going to be talking about today. As I already said, educational inequalities. And when I will talk about the German system in a moment, you will see that curricular tracking is it's a very big characteristic of the German school system. So this is also why this is one of my research interests. And now more recently, I'm trying to do empirical work on innovative teaching methods, and alongside with that, the concept of adaptive teaching. So trying to find ways how classroom instruction can be catered to the individual needs of students. And usually this is done by other types of instruction rather than just direct instruction by the teacher. So please, even in the discussion later on, feel free to also ask me questions about these other topics if you're interested. All right, I'm going to be, before I will move to the empirical work that I've done and that I'm going to present, I just want to give you a quick overview of the German education system. So most of this is in German and you don't have to read the specifics. What's important to remember is that, do you see the gray bar at the bottom? That's our primary school, and it usually lasts for 4 years. And so after that, you see how there are like different bars in different colors, and these are the different school tracks. So there are different actually school types, meaning that students will enter different schools at the age of 10. So the high achieving students will go to the academic track, and the lower achieving students will go to the low track. And then we also have an intermediate track school. So we have quite a highly structured and differentiated secondary school system. And what's also important is that these different school tracks or school types, that they also lead to different school leaving certificates. So we don't just have one high school diploma as, for example, the United States has. I don't know if you have the same here. But we have 3 different school leaving certificates. So a low school leaving certificate, an intermediate school leaving certificate, and an academic or high school leaving certificate. And what is so important about them is that only with the high school leaving certificate you are allowed to enter higher education and the university. So we don't have a test to apply for university. You have to have the highest school leaving certificate, and then you're automatically allowed for university. Sometimes it differs depending on which subject you want to study and which university, but you have the general possibility of entering higher education. So, because some of the studies I will be presenting were also conducted in the in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, I also want to say a few things about the Swiss education system. I'm not from Switzerland. I have a collaborator in Switzerland, so I cannot tell you as much about it as I can about the German school system. But you see that it's very similar in the way that primary school is the same for every student. Then they also have a lower secondary school in some states for all students, but then again they have different school types, usually at a little bit later point in time than in Germany, but also they have different school leaving certificates and different school tracks. So this is the general setup that is quite similar to the German system. And so, as I said, to summarize, the common characteristics between the German and the Swiss system is, as I said, students typically attend different secondary school tracks after elementary school, and what both those charts that I showed you, they are very like prototypical types, but actually once you go into the different states, so in Germany we have 16 different states, and in Switzerland they have what they call canton, and there are even more of them, and every state and every canton has their own education system, and so the structure of the schools might look different between those states. So it's very highly differentiated, and you cannot really, it's hard to sometimes compare the school system between different states. And on a more kind of general level, I want to emphasize that besides teaching competencies, which obviously is the main goal of schools, one goal of schools in Germany is also to teach, or not to teach, but to enhance children's autonomy. So this, I think, is also a big difference probably between the European or maybe North American countries where societies are very much focused on or have a very individualistic perspective, where the goal is to be as unique as possible in a way. And so children are encouraged to express themselves, to be outspoken actually, to be critical. This is very much the case in Germany. And so I would assume, from what I know about the Japanese culture and also the Japanese school system, this is probably a difference to what you have here. So this will be important when I present my findings later on, that this very much applies to the cultural context I'm coming from. I don't know if it will apply in the same way to this context. So this is kind of like an empirical question, or maybe you know about research. And alongside those, or talking a little bit more about cultural differences, I'm going to be talking about homework, which are given by schools, but because they're homework, they're done at home, they're done in the families. And so what's also important to know or to keep in mind about our cultural system, especially in Germany, is that kids are raised in basically two separate institutions. So they're not so much intertwined. So let's say we have Max, who is a German elementary school student, and he goes to school for usually 6 to 8 hours per day, and then he also has his family. And whereas parents usually try not to interfere with school's learning, schools usually try not to interfere with what students learn at home. So they're regarded as two separate and independent contexts which have great autonomy. And so this is also important because homework in the German context can be seen as the main bridge or the main intersection of those two institutions. So this is exactly when parents will find out about what their kids do in schools on an everyday basis. And at the same time, the teachers might know what the parents are like, depending on if the kid had got help with their homework or if the parents checked the homework. And so it's basically the only time where on a very regular basis those two contexts actually connect. I mean, of course there are some like teacher-parent meetings once a year, but talking about everyday school life, this is the main intersection. So coming to talk about parental homework involvement. So especially from the context where I'm coming from, on the one hand, homework involvement is seen as I said, a bridge or an opportunity to bridge these two main contexts. And at the same time, it is also a risk, or it can be a risk when parents help with homework, because they could interfere with children's autonomy. As I said, it's the aim of the schools, but also of most parents, to that children are capable of becoming independent learners. So sometimes when parents are interfering or trying to help in the homework situation, their kids might actually feel kind of restricted, and that's what some of my research will show. Yes, and again, sometimes, I mean, the dad helping his son, they look quite happy, but so oftentimes there's lots of conflict in the home because of homework situations. Looking at the prior research on parental homework involvement, and again, I know mostly studies from the Western cultural context, a meta-analysis by Hill and Tyson on parental involvement in general found that parental homework involvement was the only type of involvement that was not consistently related to students' achievement. So sometimes some studies found a negative association, others found a positive association, some studies found no correlation. And so when you actually look at the studies who went into the meta-analysis more closely, you can see that most of these studies have actually studied the quantity of involvement. So they have asked, how often do your parents help you with your homework? How many days per week, how many hours per day, so measures of the quantity. And it seems to be the case, or that's kind of a hypothesis that we had, that maybe just measuring how often parents help is not going to be a very good indicator if it's helpful or not. So actually, when you look at some studies that differentiated between different dimensions, you find a much more consistent pattern. So you find positive associations when parental involvement in the homework process is autonomy supportive, when it is emotionally supportive and well structured. However, when kids are perceiving parents' help as confusing, maybe their explanations are confusing, or also when they perceive them as being controlling or intrusive in the homework process, then also then negative associations were found. And even though these studies were not particularly informed by this theory, these findings are very much in line with self-determination theory that posits that children have an innate need for autonomy, competence, and social relatedness, and that environments can actually enhance these three needs by providing autonomy support through interpersonal involvement and by providing structure. So most of this research is conducted in classroom settings, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, but there's also some research on parental involvement that relates to self-determination theory, which says that whenever parents are controlling, meaning their involvement is characterized by pressure, intrusiveness, or dominance, this will undermine children's feelings of autonomy and competence. So it should be supportive of, parents should be supportive of their child's autonomy. The second feature of environments, or what parents should do, is show attention and dedication to the child-rearing process, and then also provide a framework that supports the child competence. So in the homework setting, that might be have kind of fixed rules, but not in a, or like a structure set in place. For example, that homework are always done when kids come home from school, or they're done in a specific at a specific desk, or no music is allowed while kids are doing homework. So certain structural features that they will provide during the homework process. So while we did not specifically test self-determination theory, all of the research that I'm going to present is influenced by this general theoretical background, and so lots of the measures that we developed were kind of informed by self-determination theoretical, the self-determination theory. They're not there's some, like a big self-determination community which have their fixed measures. We're not using those. So just to be clear that we don't have the kind of published measures on self-determination theory that are out there. So what I'm going to be trying to do is to ask the kind of broad question of when parental homework involvement is beneficial and when it is detrimental for students' academic development. And I will present 5 studies, and this seems like a lot, but I will I'm not going to present everything that was included in those 5 studies, and I'm not going to present one study as much in depth as I would at one conference. I'm going to kind of give you an overview of what we did and the findings, and I chose those findings from the studies that actually relate to this overall question and that kind of give a broader perspective on it. So in the first study, we try to kind of test the hypothesis that it is actually the quality of involvement rather than the quantity of involvement that makes a difference. So that's the focus of the first study. In the second study, we then only focused on the quality of involvement, and instead of just looking at achievement, which we did in the first study, we tried to have a diverse set of outcomes, so also motivational outcomes and learning behaviors, because we regard this also as important. In study 3, we have tried to study if there are different involvement types in families. So instead of having a variable-centered approach, we were doing a person-centered approach, kind of trying to see if how these different dimensions actually relate together. In study 4, we went a step further, and by looking at the reciprocal relationships between children's academic functioning and also parents' homework, because it's usually not a one-way street, and that's actually what we find. And then finally, I want to say a few things about homework conflict, because that's oftentimes something that's discussed. Before I move into the individual studies, are there any clarifying questions about the general cultural context or the kind of approach that I'm taking? If not, it's fine. I just want to make sure that I'm not moving too quickly. Okay, just raise your hands if there are questions coming up. Okay, actually there's one more general thing I want to say. So I had the opportunity to be part of a lesson study in Tokyo yesterday, which was a very unique experience for me, because this is not something that we have in Germany, actually, for several reasons. So not only are students very autonomous, teachers are very autonomous too. So once you're finished with teacher education and you start teaching as a teacher, there's no formal way of kind of feedback on your teaching. So you, as soon as the door closes behind you, nobody will see how you teach and what you do with your students. And it's actually not very, it's not common at all to even talk about different teaching practices between teachers. So every teacher has their own kind of style and has their own way of teaching, and oftentimes just the basic information, they oftentimes don't have desks in school, so they will go home to prepare their lessons. So all their lesson preparation will be done individually. And so that also means they're quite skeptical of other people's observations and feedback. So kind of observing other people's instruction is not common at all. It's actually if somebody wants to observe somebody else's instruction, they will think something might be going wrong, or it's they will be very skeptical. So teachers are don't like to be watched, and this is happening inside schools, but that also applies to us researchers. So when we as researchers want to study classroom instruction, they're very hesitant to let us into the classrooms. They don't see the benefit of discussing with us, and they will be it needs a lot of convincing and a lot of sensitivity to tell them that we're not going to evaluate them, we just want to do this for research purposes, it's all going to be anonymous. And so this affects our research quite a bit, because not only is it harder to get into schools, and also it has to be officially approved by the Ministry of Education of every state to go into schools. But it's also, the kind of methodologies that we will use to study are also influenced by this. So we will do classroom observations where we just stand in the back and there's hardly any communication with teachers, or we will have surveys where we will come in for 1 hour and do the survey and then we will leave. So the actual sort of, what I at least saw yesterday, the kind of informal communication between educational researchers and educational practitioners does not happen. So you have to keep this in mind, that this is what we have to deal with. And I actually think I'm actually becoming quite critical of our way of, I mean, this is kind of a side note, of our way of doing research in Germany, because many researchers have not even seen one classroom once. They are conducting research even though they don't know how schools look like. And so I think we need to engage more with practitioners, and because you can also learn quite a lot from, I mean, you all know this, from practitioners, and that can feed into research. And oftentimes educational research in Germany is perceived as the research only feeding into practice and not the other way around. Anyway, so that's kind of a total discussion. And one of the reasons why both parents, teachers, and students are very skeptical of educational researchers in Germany is because of the PISA study. The very first PISA study, we were very bad, and so it was the so-called PISA shock in Germany. And when you go into elementary school or even any classroom in Germany and you ask what is Pisa, they will not answer this is a city in Italy. They will tell you it's a study run by the OECD. So it's very well known, and so they're very skeptical. So just to keep this in mind, and maybe we can have a discussion about these cultural differences. Anyway, so this kind of explains the type of studies we've been conducting. So they're usually longitudinal. So all of the studies I'm presenting are longitudinal, meaning that we either had 2 measurement points at the beginning, at the end of the school year, or sometimes even over a longer stretch of time. We had questionnaire data, but we also have standardized achievement test data, usually achievement tests developed by psychometricians in our research groups. As I said, the studies I'm going to present were conducted in Germany and Switzerland. And what we did is we asked students how they perceived their parents' homework involvement in the homework process. Based on the idea that no matter what parents meant to do, we believe that it's important to have students' perceptions, because that's what actually impacts their own development. As I said, we have students' academic achievement in most of the studies, and then sometimes also measures of learning behavior and motivation. And all of the analyses I'm going to present were conducted using the M+ software, using either imputed data or the full information maximum likelihood estimator implemented in M+. And because all of the data were collected in schools, we account for the nested data structure in our models as well. So I'm not going to repeat all of these aspects for each of the studies because they're applied to all of them. The same, we also have very similar measures for parental homework involvement across the several studies. So I'm giving you example items of those basically 3 dimensions. So we have, in some studies we call it intrusive involvement, in others control, sometimes as a result of the reviews we got. So, but it's actually meaning the same thing. So one example item for intrusive involvement would be, my parents help me with my homework even when I don't need any help. One example item for supportive involvement would be, or kind of autonomy supportive involvement would be, when I'm doing my homework, I can ask my parents for help anytime. So the students know they can approach parents, but it's not actually the parents kind of coming and helping without even asking if it's needed. And then the final dimension, structure, that's what I was referring to earlier. One example item would be, my parents make sure that I have enough time and space to do my homework. So providing structure in the home for homework. All right, I'm going to be starting with the question of the quantity versus quality of parental homework involvement, which was published in the Journal of Educational Research, where we had about 1,700 students in grade 6, so at the beginning of grade 6 to the end of grade 6 in Switzerland. And here we asked the students how often parents help during a week. And then we also only differentiated between supportive and intrusive involvement. So there was no dimension. The structure dimension was not part of the study. And in this study, we focused very much on achievement. So one's measured by a standardized test, and the other measure being a student's academic grades in the school subject German, so which basically at this age means reading. And the analyses were structural equation models, which you can see by the way I present the findings, which of the variables were latent variables and which were manifest variables. So in order to kind of make the results a little bit easier across 5 studies, I decided to depict them in path models rather than have tons of tables. So you can always see in the bottom what the model also controlled for. So here we also control for prior reading achievement, so we can actually look at the change in reading achievement for students' gender, and we have several indicators of students' family background. And so I only present in the path models, and that's also applicable to the other studies. I will only present the variables of interest or the associations of interest. And yes, and these are all standardized coefficient, standardized regression coefficients. So that also applies to the other studies. So looking at how often parents help with homework, we actually found that students who reported a higher level of parents help actually had lower reading achievement in the standardized test a year later, even controlling for the prior reading achievement test. So kind of, we were actually expecting a 0 association. We were not expecting a negative association, but I will kind of explain why we think this is in a moment. So looking at our 2 measures of quality of involvement, again, supportive versus intrusive involvement, we find what previous studies have kind of predicted or are predicting, that supportive involvement, or let's say involvement that was perceived as supportive, had a positive influence on reading achievement a year later, whereas intrusive involvement, when parents helped without it being really needed, had a negative effect. And the exact same pattern was found for German reading, German grades. So it was reflected in the standardized achievement test, but it was also reflected in the actual grades that teachers assigned students during the school year. And again, this was also the case for the 2 indicators of the quality of involvement. So actually, when you look at the correlations between quantity and quality of involvement, you find quite a substantive correlation of, I think, 0.5 between the quantity of involvement and intrusive involvement. So it seems to be the case that the more parents help, the more it is perceived by students as being intrusive. So we don't have any, and that's not something our study can actually answer, what the right amount of help is. And I don't even know if it exists, but it seems to be the case that it actually is the way parents provide the help rather than that they do it every day or that they do it for so many hours per week. So this led us to mainly study the quality of involvement in the other studies. The second study, and again this is actually had a kind of a different focus, but I chose those findings that are relating to this overall question, focusing on different outcomes. So now not just on achievement, but on also you can see here the outcomes were not achievement, but also academic self-concept, homework persistence, and homework self-efficacy. So again, this study was conducted in Switzerland with a little bit less than 2,000 students, this time in grade 8, again from the beginning to the school year to the end of the school year. We again differentiated between supportive and intrusive involvement, the same measures as we used in the first study. And the reason why we have French achievement is because this was actually in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. So that was the only study that was not in the German-speaking part, but in the French-speaking part. So that's actually reading achievement. It was not French in a foreign language, so that needs to be kept in mind. And then again, structural equation modeling for our analyses. So here below, we control for the outcome at the beginning of the school year, so the elect outcome, again, students' gender. Then, because we're moving into secondary school now, we also controlled for students' school track, because as I showed at the beginning, it's important in our school system. And again, we controlled for students' family background, because we wanted to make sure that it wasn't actually parents' socioeconomic background driving these effects, which you could imagine. As you can see, we found the same pattern that we found in the first study, with supportive involvement having a positive and intrusive involvement having a negative effect, even though the standardized coefficients are smaller than what we had in the previous study. There is hardly any associations with academic self-concept. It might be the case that this is due to the way academic self-concept is developed, that develops more in relation to your peers rather than your parents' involvement. But then also homework persistence, we had only a tendency so the direction was the same, but the supportive involvement was not statistically significant. Intrusive involvement had a slightly small negative effect. And the largest effects we found for homework self-efficacy, which in a way makes sense when you think about what if parents kind of help or not, that students feel like they're capable of doing their own homework, which in a way, in order to become a lifelong learner, which everybody talks about these days, it's important that you feel self-efficacious, I think that's the right word, right? To do your own homework. So if parents are supportive, meaning they offer help without actually helping when it's not needed, then students are becoming more confident in actually doing their homework, whereas when parents are controlling and intrusive in the homework process, it decreases students' homework self-efficacy. So in a way, it seems to be the case that this is a consistent pattern even across different outcomes. So as I already said, this is a German study at the German Journal of Developmental and Educational Psychology. Well, we try to see how the different dimensions kind of relate towards each other. So We used a little bit less than 4,000 students in grade 5 in Germany, again, beginning and end of the school year. And here we have now 3 different measures or dimensions of parental involvement, parental homework involvement: responsiveness, control, and structure. So more reflecting the self-determination theoretical framework. And again, we have reading achievement in a standardized test, as we did in study 1. And in order to find or to analyze the question whether there are different types, we did latent profile analysis to testing whether different numbers of types could be best represent the data. And then later on we conducted regressions to see whether they differentially affect students' development. So this is the kind of profile of the model that fit the data best. So the model fits for the three types where had the best model fit. And so the bold line that you see here is the average of the sample. And then you can see that in terms of the level of control, there were actually quite small differences between the families, and for structure bigger difference. But the biggest differences were actually in terms of parents' responsiveness. So in a way, this tells you that depending on how responsive parents are during the homework process actually affects how whether the help is being perceived as controlling or not. So, or put it differently, the way or the level of responsiveness interacts with the level of control, meaning that if you have high levels of responsiveness, or parents show high levels of responsiveness, and then it apparently is not as bad to sometimes help without it being needed. Whereas when you also have no kind of emotional support for students, then it also is very problematic when parents provide control. So, well, anyway, that's actually what I'm showing in the next slide. I'm kind of already jumping to the results. So you can see that the main differentiation is in terms of responsiveness, not so much in control, a little bit more in structure. So what we then wanted to do is to see if those types differentially kind of affect, even though that's not the right term to use, students' development, or put differently, if students belonging to these 3 different types of families developed differently during the school year. So what we did, we again ran a regression analysis where we used the type. We took the type that we found, and so one student was how to say this? So for each student, we knew which type of family they were growing up in, and then we used type 1, so kind of the theoretically best type, as the reference category. So this is the omitted reference category. This is why it's not shown here. So these are 2 dummy variables, meaning that this will show you the difference between type 2 versus type 1 and type 3 versus type 1 in terms of reading achievement. And so even if you control for reading achievement at the beginning of the school year, you will see that students in type 2 families had slightly lower reading achievement at the end of the school year, whereas the type 3 students which grew up or were in families where they had very low levels of responsiveness had even lower levels of reading achievement after a school year. So in in study 4, we tried to look at reciprocal relations between students' academic functioning and parental involvement, assuming that even we found those differences between parents and families. And then the question is, so have they always been this different, or what makes them so different? And we wanted to see how much students or their children themselves kind of have an impact on parents, the way parents help. And so we had quite a long time frame this time, so we looked at a time frame from grade 5 to grade 7 in a sample of about 3,000 students. We again had the 3 measures of parental involvement. We had again reading achievement in a standardized test, reading effort, and then also homework procrastination to have a broader set of outcomes. And then we conducted structural equation modeling as in the other, the first 2 studies, and then for the reciprocal relationship conducted cross-leg models to see if we find those associations. But I'm going to be starting with actually cross-sectional analyses. So to see whether, so these are all results from grade 5. So trying to predict how the level of responsiveness in parents' involvement. So we control for socioeconomic background, school track, and sex, and we wanted to see how students' kind of achievement and students' learning behavior affected parents' involvement. And we actually did find that the higher the students' test scores in the standardized reading achievement test, the more responsive parents were. We did not find any associations between responsiveness and reading grade. And we also found that the more effort students put into or showed in reading, the more responsive parents were, and the more they procrastinated their homework, the fewer responsive parents were. And so this was actually in similar ways. I mean, here reading achievement and homework procrastination are the kind of more important predictors for control. So the other way around, the more, the better the reading achievement, the fewer control, and the more procrastination, the more control. Makes sense. And actually for structure, there was only an association with reading effort. So the more reading effort students showed, the more structure parents provided. And so these are all cross-sectional associations that kind of indicate that there might be some reciprocal relations going on. So we then kind of tested this in a cross-leg model across 3 school years. So you can see the variables on the left are from grade 5, and then the exact same variables were tested 3, or well, it's always the beginning and the end of the school year, so it's actually 3 school years. And then, without going into detail for the paths, you can see that there are indeed these reciprocal relations, and only statistically significant associations are shown here. And so, yeah, you can see that it's not the case that parents have a fixed behavior that they will just apply or show, that actually the way students are will also influence parents, and you can imagine that this is kind of like a back and forth going process throughout children's development throughout school.
Are these all significant?
Yes, these are all statistically significant. Yes, exactly. Yeah, because it would have been, the picture would have been too crowded. I mean, talking about diagrams, or if I had included all the other paths. So in a way, we were lucky that not more paths were significant, then it would have been very messy. Yeah, or I would have presented them in a table. All right, so coming to my final study that I want to present today, we then started more recently some work on parental, or how parental involvement relates to homework conflict between parents and students. Because this is oftentimes at least in Germany and Switzerland, a factor in the debate whether homework should even be used in schools. And some are, yeah, but this only creates conflicts. Why should they be conducted anyway? And so we had about 2,800 students and their parents from grade 8. And here again, we focus on secondary school students, partly also because we believe that at an age where students may be more oriented towards their peers because they're moving towards adolescence, maybe there are more conflicts with parents. And we had the same measures that we had in the 2 previous studies: responsiveness, control, and structure. What's new about this study is that we did not only measure these 3 dimensions via student ratings, we also asked parents what they thought, what they were doing, based on the assumption that conflict is always a two-way process, or process. And then the outcome was homework conflict. And again, structural equation modeling was used for our analyses. So starting with the findings from parent reports, we found, and again, these are the findings across 1 school year. So we control the level of homework conflict between families, between parents and children at the beginning of the school or at the end of the previous school year. And then we want to predict the homework conflict in the next school year. And we could see that the more parents thought they were responsive, the fewer conflict there was. And for the other 2 dimensions, there was no association. Well, interestingly, when we looked at students' reports, we found a different pattern. So again, the first dimension works in the same way, meaning when students perceived their parents as being responsive, then they also reported fewer homework conflict. But now, and that's quite different to the parent reports, they perceived their when they perceived their parents being controlling in the homework process, they also reported more homework conflict. So, and keep in mind, these are the exact same parents and students. So we met, these are the same, these are the same families, and the perspectives apparently are quite different, and they're also on what's happening. So maybe when parents are thinking they're helping, their students might actually perceive that help as being very intrusive and controlling, and which they perceive as being a conflicting situation for them. All right, so to wrap up, kind of putting all these 5 kind of studies back together, we could find that parental homework involvement does provide the opportunity for the 2 main institutions to serve as a bridge between those 2 main institutions. And it can actually have a positive consequence for academic development, especially when it is when parents provide structure at home and when they're being responsive. So meaning that students know they can approach parents, that parents are kind of ready to help and are kind of emotionally supportive and autonomy supportive. And this might actually also then strengthen the relationship between children and parents, because they know what's going on in students' lives. But at the same time, it can also be detrimental. So there can be the risk that whenever parental help, or what they think is help, is perceived as being intrusive or controlling, then this can actually negatively affect students' academic development, and even, do the opposite of what they're trying to do. Well, because obviously they want to improve students' academic development. And so in a way, one of the collaborator, Sandra Moroni, who was a co-author on most of these studies, and even for the first author on 2 of them, she does parent trainings, so she does teacher trainings for how to deal with parents, but she also does parent trainings and kind of trying to talk about our findings and to at least raise a level of sensitivity that maybe to just communicate with your own child how your help is being perceived. Yeah, and because in a way you could assume that given the findings from study 4, so the reciprocal relationships, you could imagine that there being the risk of a vicious circle, meaning that students who perform low in school, their parents will increase their level of help, which will be perceived as controlling, and then this will actually lead to fewer, like a lower development. So from the practitioner point of view, it would be I think advisable to kind of raise awareness of the situation. From a more research-oriented perspective, and to be, besides going into like the methodological or design limitations of each of the studies, I think one aspect that needs to be kept in mind that I did not look at in these studies is the kind of cognitive stimulating aspect of homework. So this is very much focused on the emotional quality of parental homework involvement, but you could also study how much the type of explanations or the content of the kind of help that parents provide, how that differs in terms of being stimulating for students' cognitive development. And that's something where the type of studies that we've been conducting is actually coming to its limits. So asking with questionnaire data how stimulating certain explanations were is not, as far as I know, not very feasible and possible. And so you need much more either qualitative or observational studies where you actually kind of watch how the interaction takes place and then maybe code the level of depth of explanations that parents provide. But unfortunately, because of the skepticism towards educational researchers, and also because this takes a lot of money and I didn't have that grant money, I've not been able to do this so far. And finally, on a broader level, to kind of put this back into perspective, I mean, this is very much zoomed in perspective on what happens between parents and students, but I mean, we have to keep in mind that homework are provided by teachers, and that the way teachers or the quality of homework themselves might affect what's going on in the home. So if you have homework that are always too difficult for students, this will create problems at home. Whereas if a teacher manages to find the exact right amount of level of homework, both in terms of its quantity but also its level of difficulty, and maybe like if it's interesting to students, that will also affect the homework process. So this is a new kind of research area that I'm working towards right now. My general interest in adaptive teaching and how does that also apply to homework. And together with Sandra, my collaborator from Switzerland, we will also try to focus more on individualized and adaptive homework assignments, and how this not only affects students' academic development, but also how this affects the situation in the home. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and your interest.